Thank you, BISF, distinguished panelists, and faculty. My name is Trisha. My team member Lisa and I are delighted to present our proposal on development finance policy for universal electricity access. As an overview, we'll introduce energy access concepts, provide background on development finance, discuss, then evaluate our proposal, and conclude with domestic impact. Let's begin. Energy poverty impacts 840 million individuals. Energy poverty is a decline in well-being caused by use of polluting fuels and lack of modern energy services. According to the UN, 13% of the world's population do not have adequate electricity access, 40% don't have clean fuels, and 31% of primary schools don't have electricity. This has resounding effects. In terms of health and safety, a lack of electricity restricts families to solid fuel such as kerosene, firewood, and charcoal to cook food and heat rooms. These release toxic pollutants responsible for 2.8 million premature deaths per year. In terms of healthcare, electricity is cheaper than diesel generators, enables clinics to utilize modern medical technology, refrigerated medicine storage, and sterilization. In terms of education, a pilot program installed electricity for schools in the Philippines, India, and Morocco, reporting higher student attendance and engagement. Of course, electricity allows use of computers and the internet, which correlates with higher rates of degree completion, literacy, trade openness, and even income. Finally, in terms of the economy, there is a strong correlation between energy use and GDP. Access to modern energy services improves productivity and enables local income generation. We can address energy poverty with the evolution of U.S. foreign aid policy, from simple grants to private sector partnerships. USAID is the U.S. grant agency, and OPIC is the retired development finance agency. In 2018, USAID received $20 billion in Congress appropriations and contributed 476 megawatts of new electricity. The same year, OPIC was appropriated only $60 million, but generated more electricity and profited $149 million. Tapping into the private sector will allocate more funding for development projects, facilitate sustainable foreign development, and lead other countries towards self-reliance. Let's discuss how development finance works. Development finance institutions, or DFIs, invest in projects in low-income countries to stimulate sustainable economic growth. DFIs mimic organic private investment. They offer similar services but at lower cost and make profit. Ability to profit distinguishes DFIs from grant agencies like USAID. DFIs identify high-impact projects, invest, and catalyze investment too, i.e. encourage private businesses to invest. Projects are intensively screened to ensure sustainability and minimal damage to society and environment. DFIs must not compete with private firms and must evaluate if the project can secure capital without the DFI or if the project is too high risk for private businesses. 2013 and 2014, DFIs were the largest contributors of energy finance in 20 countries with the most restricted energy access. Between 2012 and 2016, single government-owned bilateral DFIs committed over $10 billion to energy projects, making energy their largest sector investment. U.S.-owned DFI is the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, formerly the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. In 2016, the OPIC dedicated 34% of its portfolio to the energy sector. In 2018, it generated 500 megawatts of new electricity. The 2018 BUILD Act established the DFC as a consolidated version of the OPIC and other financing agencies. The DFC offers 4 products: 1, political risk insurance; 2, equity finance, which includes direct equity and equity funds; 3, debt finance, which includes loans and guarantees; and 4, technical assistance. Before the BUILD Act, the OPIC was limited by the maximum exposure cap of $29 billion, operated at a much lower budget than other DFIs, could not offer equity investments, and was severely understaffed. By the BUILD Act, the DFC has an investment limit of $60 billion, authorization for equity finance, more staff, and augmented services. We emphasize equity finance because it is a higher risk and higher return than OPIC's primary method, debt financing, which is why equity is a popular instrument among DFIs. The DFC can use the latest research and recommendations to optimize its funds. We recommend streamlining the DSC to optimize investment and avoid issues that the OPIC had: accountability, low rates of return, lack of equity financing, and flawed project criteria. This is the most cost-effective and impactful policy to promote electricity access.
The following define ways the DFC can maximize energy access. We propose modifying the BUILD Act and DFC by eliminating U.S. affiliation preference, reevaluating equity finance benefit, reducing the small business requirement, involving local businesses, and ensuring transparency and accountability. DFC is mandated to prefer projects by U.S.-owned businesses. While this supports the American economy, it hinders development efforts by barring foreign companies. Nullification of the preference removes barriers to investment in key foreign businesses, especially ones local to the project's recipient country. Local business participation is essential for sustainable economic development and sovereignty. Removing the preference can also open DFC to co-finance with other DFIs, which shares risks, so higher return rates from equity finance can be safely leveraged. For these reasons, preference for U.S. businesses limits free trade, its global benefits, and the DFC's positive impact on developing nations. Compared to loans, equity is high return, high risk, and capital intensive. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, scored equity in a 1-to-1 ratio against the budget, regarding it as an irretrievable grant rather than a long-term investment. Thus, the DFC is limited to 35% equity of its total portfolio. Of the other 4 major DFIs, 3 hold higher percentages of equity. The OMB must reevaluate equity to account for potential returns.
Data reveals that the impact of equity finance is much higher for equity than loan investments, 12% versus 8%, demonstrating that equity is associated with exceptional development results. Equity also eliminates immediate obligations to repay funds, allowing the U.S. to authoritatively co-finance with other countries and offer larger sums of capital to local businesses. In 2016, equity generated 239,000 jobs for large recipient firms and stimulated growth of 18% in small businesses. Equity creates jobs in unstable markets and supports small business growth, 2 major development goals. Increasing employment provides a stronger base of human capital to actualize universal electrification. These advantages can be unlocked by reevaluating the profitability of equity, relieving the 35% equity limit, and allowing greater liberty of this powerful tool.
50% of DFC projects must originate from small businesses. Known as set-aside policy, this is intended to support small businesses, which are more likely to be involved in local markets than large firms are. However, this is a flawed and indirect attempt at local sustainability. Instead, DFC should focus on local businesses, large or small. Small businesses primarily occupy service-producing sectors: retail, real estate, entertainment, and finance. Utilities and energy fall under the goods-producing category, in which only 20% of small businesses lie. Set-aside policy limits free competition, creates economic inefficiency, uneven and unsustainable growth, and barriers to entry in the federal contracting space. The unnatural mandate of 50% fosters disproportionate investment in small businesses. To best develop energy infrastructure, we must return to the 30% requirement the OPIC operated with, which allows wise incorporation of small businesses. In lieu of the small business minimum, 50% of DFC funds should be allocated to local businesses in energy and finance. This policy prevents local economies from relying on foreign capital and becoming susceptible to an outflight of foreign investors, which occurred in Southeast Asia at the turn of the last century, triggering a financial crisis. This policy would stimulate local economies, promoting sustainable construction of energy infrastructure, goals not achievable through foreign financial injections into regional economies. An Inspector General has been appointed to oversee the agency, an improvement from previous use of USAID Inspector General, which resulted in environmental and social violations, failure to compensate local workers, and collaboration with companies accused of workers' rights abuses. With an Inspector General specifically assigned to the DFC, such mishandling of human rights will be avoided. While the DFC is mandated to provide greater data transparency than its predecessor, more disclosed impact and development data is needed for public faith in the DFC's ability to promote U.S. policy and foreign development. DFC must process complaints from locals, continually improve policy, create a reserve fund for damaged communities, implement incentives to reward staff for positive community impact, and consult with public NGOs and nonprofits on policies and investments.
Now that we have made our proposal, we'll evaluate our policy, application of development finance for energy access. Because DFIs provide the same financial services as private firms, but at lower prices, a major concern is crowding out private investment and distorting regional markets. If development finance is employed where private lenders are willing to invest, crowding out can occur. To address this concern, DFC abides by an additionality requirement to operate by internationally recognized best practices and to avoid market-distorting government subsidies and crowding out private lending. DFC upholds the stipulation by focusing on low and lower middle income countries where it is too risky for private investment firms to operate, and abiding by strict criteria for projects, such as proof that prior attempts to secure capital from private firms have failed. DFIs have been accused of promoting development for the host country's best interest rather than the recipients. However, OPIC data says otherwise. Some highlights of OPIC's 2017 impact include bringing 1,200 megawatts of electricity to rural areas, catalyzing $10 billion in emerging markets, generating $800 million in tax revenue. Indeed, a 10% increase in OPIC financing correlated with a 1.3% annual growth in low-income countries. Clearly, development finance is centered upon benefiting recipient countries and promoting positive externalities in the host countries. Less developed countries are not always risky investments, especially given DFC's new ease of co-financing and equity capabilities. In fact, LDCs are frequently more profitable than more developed nations. Studies indicate returns on investment as high as 13% in LDCs, compared to an 8% average on projects in higher income countries. A key advantage of investing in LDCs is the diminished competition. LDCs have made substantial efforts to place tax incentives and minimal capital requirements for foreign investors. LDCs are most lacking in energy access. We must acknowledge their profitability so development finance can be applied where it is most needed.
USAID grant assistance is problematic for its one-time economic injections, which have characterized American foreign aid. The DFC and its predecessor OPIC, however, embraced impact investing, short-term projects to catalyze long-term independent growth. OPIC's portfolio for impact investing, worth $70 million, has been transferred to the DFC to continue the legacy. Impact investors will be key partners for the DFC to deploy capital for global development goals. These efforts guide recipient countries to self-reliance and enduring energy access and security. Close by emphasizing the benefits of these policies for investments increase national security. With supplementation of infrastructure, weakened states are stabilized and global crime halted due to economic benefits reaped by developing countries. The OPIC consistently yielded profits, accruing $5.7 billion in its 40-year lifetime. Given that with an investment cap of $29 billion, the OPIC returned $115 million to the U.S. Treasury in 2018, it is reasonable to assume that the DFC, with its $60 billion cap, will generate even greater returns. Finally, U.S. business interests are promoted as the DFC partners with U.S. corporations to fund initiatives in developing countries. Increased international trade and investment, which results from developing finance, leads to American job creation. Though these domestic positive externalities may be more intangible, they should not be discounted. We reiterate amending the BUILD Act to optimize the DFC's capabilities and impact. Development finance is effective for bringing electricity to all while promoting U.S. foreign policy and making profit. Thank you for your time and take care.